When the great island of Atlantis sank beneath the sea, legend says its people vanished with it. But what if they didn't? What if the end of Atlantis was not the end at all, but the beginning of every great civilization that came after? From the deserts of Egypt to the jungles of Central America, across the Andes and the plains of Mesopotamia, the same stories repeat themselves. A flood that wiped out an ancient world, gods who came from the sea, and knowledge that no one could explain. How did the ancient Egyptians know the stars so well? Why did the Mayans build pyramids so precise they mirrored those of Giza? And why do so many ancient gods, Ra, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha, all share the same symbol of the rising sun? Maybe they weren't gods at all. Maybe they were the last survivors of a world older than our history books will ever admit. A world that fell beneath the waves, only to rise again through the hands of its scattered children. Tonight, we follow those survivors from the ashes of Atlantis to the birth of our known world, because sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't buried under the sea. They're hidden in plain sight, in the temples, the stones, and the bloodlines of humanity itself. This is the story of the survivors of Atlantis, the civilizations they became, echoes of the flood. Every legend begins with water, the sea, giver of life and taker of it. For thousands of years, ancient texts from every corner of the world have whispered of a great flood, a moment when the world was wiped clean, and civilization had to begin again. In Mesopotamia, it was the story of Utnapishtim, the man who built a great boat to survive the gods' wrath. The Sumerians wrote of the same flood that ended a forgotten age, an age of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years before the waters came. Across the desert, the Egyptians told a similar tale. They believed that the god Atum wept, and his tears became the flood that ended the first time, the Zep Tepi, when the gods still walked among men. And far across the ocean, the Mayans spoke of Hunab-Ku, who destroyed the world with water so that humanity could be reborn. The Incas said Viracocha rose from Lake Titicaca to teach the survivors how to rebuild. Even the Bible, one of the most enduring texts on earth, begins its history with the same story, a flood that erased the arrogance of mankind. These aren't coincidences. They're echoes, fragments of the same memory carried through time by those who refuse to let it die. Because behind every myth there lies a truth. What if all of these stories, from Sumer to Egypt, from the Andes to the jungles of Mesoamerica, were describing the same event? A cataclysm so vast it destroyed an entire world in a single generation. To scientists, it's called the Younger Dryas impact, a sudden return to ice around 12,000 years ago when the planet's temperature dropped and sea levels rose hundreds of feet. But to those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. When the ice melted, oceans swallowed the coastlines. Mountains crumbled, rivers changed their course. Whole continents shifted, and with them the memories of civilizations that once stood proud. If Atlantis truly existed, this would have been its final moment. A night when fire rained from the sky, earthquakes split the land, and the sea consumed its shining towers. But maybe, just maybe, not everyone perished. Some may have fled before the end. Guided by the stars, they could have reached new lands, taking with them fragments of their lost world, knowledge of astronomy, architecture, mathematics, and the laws of balance between man and nature. And wherever they arrived, the legends of gods emerging from the sea began. In Egypt, they called him Thoth, the god of wisdom who brought writing to man. In Sumer, he was Enki, the lord of the abyss, protector of knowledge. In South America, he became Viracocha, or Quetzalcoatl, a bearded god who came from across the ocean, teaching language and science before vanishing again into the West. Different names, different continents, but always the same story. A teacher from the sea, carrying the memory of a world that fell. So, the flood wasn't just an ending. It was a passage, a bridge from one world to another. The waters washed away the arrogance of the old, but they also carried the seeds of everything new. And those seeds would soon take root. In the lands of Egypt, in the valleys of Mesopotamia, in the mountains of the Andes, the survivors of Atlantis, if they truly existed, had found new homes. And from those homes, they began to build the world we now call ancient. But the question remains, how much of what we call ancient wisdom was actually inherited from a civilization long before history began to count? The architects of civilization. If Atlantis truly perished beneath the waves, then its survivors would have carried with them more than memories. They would have carried blueprints. And wherever they settled, they began to rebuild what they had lost. In the Nile Valley, thousands of years before modern Egypt was born, massive stones were cut with precision so exact, even the smallest gap between them can barely fit a blade of grass. The pyramids of Giza, aligned perfectly with the stars of Orion's belt, still defy modern engineering. How could a civilization of farmers and copper tools lift stones weighing more than 50 tons and place them with surgical precision? The ancient Egyptians said it wasn't their doing. Their ancestors told them the knowledge came from the first time, from beings who came from the water and taught them the science of the heavens. Those words echo again across the ocean. In South America, the Incas spoke of Viracocha, a tall, bearded teacher who rose from Lake Titicaca, taught language and architecture, and vanished westward across the Pacific. The same image appears in Mesoamerica. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, god of knowledge and civilization, was said to have come from across the sea, carrying tools of wisdom before promising to return one day. And in Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization. The first king lists mention a strange time before the flood, when the kings descended from heaven and ruled for tens of thousands of years. When the flood came, those rulers vanished. But when the waters receded, new cities rose almost overnight. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, with writing, laws, and astronomy already perfected. It was as if knowledge simply reappeared, not discovered, but remembered. Archaeologists often speak of sudden emergence, how agriculture, writing, and monumental architecture all appeared almost simultaneously around the world, around the same time, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Coincidence? Or the return of something older? Some researchers, fringe to the academic world, yet relentless, believe these are not coincidences at all, that civilizations like Egypt, Sumer, and the Inca didn't invent their wisdom, they inherited it. Consider the ancient maps, the Piri Reis chart, drawn in the 16th century but somehow depicting the coastline of Antarctica without its ice cap. Something that hasn't existed for over 6,000 years. Or the Orontius Phineus map, showing rivers and mountains now buried under glaciers. These maps weren't guesses. They were copies, fragments of a knowledge older than our recorded history. And if such maps survived into the hands of later explorers, where did the originals come from? Perhaps from a seafaring civilization that once charted the world before the flood erased their cities. The Greeks called them Atlanteans. The Egyptians called them the followers of Thoth. The Sumerians knew them as the Apkallu, wise beings sent by the gods before the flood to teach mankind all the arts of civilization. Different names, same pattern, teachers from the sea, builders who vanished as suddenly as they appeared. In Egypt, the Great Sphinx bears the marks of water erosion, suggesting it's far older than the Sahara's desert age, perhaps predating even dynastic Egypt. In Peru, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman fits stones so precisely that not even modern lasers can explain their interlocking design. In Turkey, Göbekli Tepe stands as proof of monumental architecture long before humans were supposed to build anything. The more we uncover, the older everything becomes. Every discovery pushes the birth of civilization further back, closer and closer to the same period Plato described as the fall of Atlantis. What if these builders were not gods, but refugees? Survivors of a drowned world, determined to rebuild their knowledge before it disappeared completely. And if that's true, then Atlantis never really died. It was reborn, piece by piece, in the hands of its children. Egypt, Sumer, Inca, Maya, different lands, same fingerprint. The architecture, the mathematics, the alignment with stars, all singing the same melody from a civilization long forgotten, the melody of the sea, the song of Atlantis. If Atlantis truly lived on through its survivors, then its greatest monument isn't buried beneath the ocean. It's written in us. The ancient world spoke the same language of symbols: the sun, the serpent, the flood, and the mountain. In Egypt, the sun rose from the lotus. In Mesoamerica, it emerged from the jaws of a feathered serpent. In Sumer, it was carried across the heavens by Utu, the god of light, the same image born from oceans apart. These aren't coincidences, they're echoes of an older code, passed down through myth, ritual, and bloodline. Look closer at the architecture of the ancients. The pyramids of Giza, Teotihuacan, and Nubia all share the same sacred geometry. The same 52-degree angle, the same northward orientation. None of these builders ever met, and yet they built as though they remembered the same teacher. Even their beliefs align. All speak of a golden age before the flood, a time of perfect balance between man, nature, and the cosmos. The Egyptians called it Zep Tepi, the Greeks called it Kronos, the Hindus called it Satya Yuga, a world not defined by conquest, but by harmony. But something changed. As millennia passed, the memory of Atlantis became distorted. The teachers became gods, the survivors became myths, and humanity, their students, began to forget. Knowledge turned into religion, symbols turned into superstition. Yet the traces remain, carved into stone, etched in stars, woven into our DNA. When the Sphinx stares east, it faces not just the sunrise, but the age of Leo, a time roughly 12,000 years ago, around the same era when Atlantis was said to fall. Was that a coincidence, or a message left for those who would one day remember? Some scientists now suspect our planet has faced multiple cycles of catastrophe: asteroid impacts, pole shifts, global floods. And after each reset, humanity rises again, a little wiser, a little more prepared, yet still chasing the same mysteries left behind. Maybe the story of Atlantis isn't about a city that vanished. Maybe it's a warning, a memory encoded deep within our collective soul, reminding us of what happens when we forget balance, when our technology outpaces our wisdom. Because history doesn't just move forward, it moves in circles. And somewhere in that circle, Atlantis is waiting, not as ruins, but as an idea. A dream of what humanity once was, and what it could be again. The real question isn't whether Atlantis existed. The question is, are we becoming it? The story of Atlantis has haunted humanity for over 2,000 years. Some say it was a fable, some say it was memory, but maybe it's both. Every myth begins with a truth and ends as a warning. We build towers that scrape the sky, wield forces that can split atoms and connect continents in a breath. We call it progress, but so did they. The Atlanteans, if they ever existed, were said to have mastered energy, geometry, and the mind itself, until arrogance made them believe they were gods. And when the balance broke, the sea reclaimed its due. Perhaps that's why the story still lives, because it isn't just their story, it's ours. Humanity, standing once again at the edge of its own creation, daring the sea to rise. The ruins of Atlantis may never be found beneath the waves, but its spirit, the rise, the brilliance, the fall, repeats with every civilization that forgets where it came from. Maybe the survivors of Atlantis didn't just rebuild the world, maybe they became the world. And maybe, in their final act, they left us a message. Remember what came before, so you don't repeat it again. This was Old Man's Tales, where forgotten civilizations whisper again. Until the next story, remember, what we call legend may one day call us.